Welcome to ENside Politics, the Express News' new weekly podcast on all things political in San Antonio. I'm Metro Editor Greg Jefferson. I'm joined today by Molly Smith, one of our crack City Hall reporters, and our special guest today is Heywood Sanders, Professor Emeritus of Public Administration at UTSA. Heywood has done a lot of thinking and writing over the last few decades on how private interests influence how your tax dollars get spent. You had a great book in 2014 called Convention Center Follies. That's right. Power, Politics, and Public Administration. It was a great takedown on how cities waste a lot of money on convention center expansions. A lot of your work has kind of been in that vein. So, as someone who takes a really kind of gimleted eye to big projects undertaken by municipalities, I wanted to have you on today because we're going to be talking about the Missions Stadium, which City Council will be voting on, at least the financial terms of the agreement, this Thursday. It's a $160 million stadium, and the city and county is picking up, $126 million of that, leaving the owners to cover $34 million. Does that seem fair to you?
About 80% public. Right. So it seems a little loaded. Right. 80% seems like it's a little loaded on the public side.
Maybe. We'll also be talking about Project Marvel, which is this kind of, it's not really well defined because the city is not talking about it at all. In fact, the city of San Antonio's wrapped up all of the consultants and real estate developers and various parties with non-disclosure agreements. So you were just getting a wall of silence about Project Marvel. But because of reporting the Express News has done over the last 14 months, we know that it involves the proposed expansion of the convention center, some major upgrades at the Alamo Dome, and probably, most likely, a new Spurs arena at Hemisphere. And to tie all of this together like a nice big bow could be a land bridge going from the Alamo Dome stretching over to the Hemisphere property. Maybe. The city, as we understand it, it's kind of they're working on what the overall cost of that will be. But in an email to a real estate consultant about a year ago, Lori Houston, who's an assistant city manager who oversees downtown operations, put the price for all of Project Marvel about $3 to $4 billion. Yeah. So we'll get into that in a bit. Let's go back to the Missions deal. Does this look familiar to you at all?
It looks enormously familiar. It looks familiar in the narrow sense that with your invitation to join you today, I decided to check back and see when the local reportage of the Express News picked up first this notion of Graham Weston's desire for a downtown ballpark plopped right nearby his land holdings and potential developments on the west side of downtown. And the earliest I could come up with was a story that ran in December of, let's make sure about that date, 2012. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the chuckle.
This was actually before Weston Urban, the developer who owns all of that property.
Exactly.
So
this is not news in some sense.
Right.
Graham Weston's desire to leverage a ballpark, and he makes clear in this story that he expects it to be paid for by the public sector to advantage his land holdings and development dreams, has been on the public agenda for a dozen years. And so this great rush to push this thing through the city council right now is in some ways amusing and in some ways enormously sad and disturbing. No, this is not news. And at the same time, it's part of a pretty long-standing pattern here about how we tend to do the public's business when it comes to a large-scale development deal.
Just in fairness, I'll say, as part of the timing, you do have Major League Baseball, which runs minor league baseball, right? So they're trying to bring all the minor league stadium standards up to snuff. Nelson Wolff Stadium, which is about 30 years old, on the west side, is not going to cut it. It's a pretty rundown, seedy stadium. I don't know if you've spent a lot of time there. MLB has told the Mission's owners, you either need to make some major renovations to Wolff Stadium or get a new stadium. They're opting for a new stadium. Go ahead.
Yeah, but this has been Graham Weston's notion for well over a decade. So we've had time in this community. We've had time on the part of both the city and the county to consider a whole bunch of alternative approaches to locating a stadium, to raise the question of whether the particular site that Weston's interested in is in fact the optimal one from any number of standpoints and criteria. To ask the question, what's the optimal way to finance it? How can we get the best deal for the public? And I recognize MLB's deadline, but we had the time, had we chosen as a community to hash this thing out publicly, carefully, thoughtfully, and let me stress, in the context of some larger substantive downtown plan, that would consider, a whole host of alternative locations. And yet, much as we did with the Alamo Dome, much as we did with the then AT&T, now Frost Bank Center, all of a sudden there's a great rush to do something and it goes in one place for reasons that have very little to do with the kind of long-term development potential of those kinds of investments. Other cities, sometimes, not always.
I was going to say, so give me an example of a city that actually made it a public process where they said, hey, you know what? We're thinking about building a downtown stadium, whether it's baseball, basketball, or whatever. Help us out. Does that ever happen?
Sure, it happens. It happens to varying degrees in varying places. One of the dynamics we've seen in the case particularly of NFL stadiums and to some extent in major league ballparks, is that team owners have come to recognize the development potential of stadiums themselves. The classic case in Los Angeles, technically Inglewood, California, was Stan Kroenke's development of a new stadium for the now back to LA Rams, and did that enormously expensive and expansive stadium privately. Recognizing that the activity that a stadium generates had the potential to bring people into a particular location and offer that team development opportunities. A very parallel thing also happened in LA with the development of what was then the Staples Center Arena. For basketball and hockey, and the adjacent area there in the South Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. Something offering some parallels in Dallas with the development of the American Airlines Arena by Ross Perot Jr. and his investment, taking a former power plant brownfield site that was very problematic from a environmental and development point of view, and developing it with surrounding apartments, hotel, restaurants, etc. The arena was paid for by the public sector, but there was a substantial commitment and plan on the part of Perot for that surrounding Victory District. Interestingly enough, the asterisk there is it didn't work quite as well or in the fashion that he intended. They don't always pay off.
Right. In fact, often don't.
Often don't.
So the way this, the basically term sheet that the city council is going to be voting on Thursday, the deal is structured in a way that, like I said, so you've got this $34 million participation. That's as they refer to it. Basically, they're the owners who include Graham Weston and Randy Smith, who are co-founders of Weston Urban. They'll be putting up $34 million. The city and county will be putting up the rest. They'll be doing that through the Houston Street Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone, a TERS. So the money. Explain how that's going to work, and we'll take it from there.
Well, let me try and give you the condensed version of the TERS lecture.
Yeah.
What the state of Texas calls TERS are what in the rest of the country are known as tax increment districts. And that idea dates back to the middle of the 1950s in the midst of the federal urban renewal program, when some states were looking for ways to allow municipalities to come up with the local share of the funding that would generate federal urban renewal funds. And the idea behind that was, if you make some catalytic public investment in a particularly defined piece of geography, a zone in this case, that public investment will cause new private investment and development to happen, and that one can take the incremental tax revenues within that zone, within that area, the added property tax beyond what the area had generated previously, and use that to pay for that catalytic investment, in essence, to repay the debt that you would take on for that. And for those purposes, it worked reasonably well. In some areas, it could be problematic in others. Texas came to it relatively late, but as did San Antonio. But it became a very popular device in lots of places. Dallas is very notable that way, as a way to provide public support for a new private development. And typically with the argument that but for the TERS and the public investment that it pays for, that area wouldn't generate any new tax revenue, and therefore it, ahem, with air quotes, pays for itself. There are lots of issues and questions about that fundamentally.
Because, hey, I mean, it sounds like free money.
It sounds like free money. And, you know, when it sounds like free money, thoughtful people ought to wonder.
Right.
But the Houston Street TERS is a particularly intriguing case for a lot of reasons.
Well, I mean, as the name implies, it seems like its original goal was to revitalize Houston Street. And boy, that's a thoroughfare that really needs revitalizing. And it hasn't actually worked out very well.
Not very well. It certainly needed revital. I mean, it was at one time our great retail strip, anchored by Josky's on the east and Wolf and Mark's department store on the west, with Frost Brothers, some longtime older residents may remember our lovely Frost Brothers department store. I mean, it was a major retail center for the city and the metropolitan region. And sadly went downhill, as lots of downtown retail centers of similar vintage did in the post-World War II era. So a national developer, Federal Realty Investment from Maryland, comes here and says, we have a great vision for Houston Street. We've done retail projects like this in other parts of the country, notably in Santa Monica, California. We are going on to do similar projects in Bethesda, Maryland, a Washington, D.C. suburb, and in San Jose, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley. We see Houston Street as promising. We just need some public investment with public dollars to make our vision come true. And what we see are major national retailers, once again, lining Houston Street. And they pointed, among other things, to Bath and Body Works and Barnes and Noble. And they fully expected that those folks would turn up there if only we did a couple of things. And they wanted connections from the Riverwalk and its wonderful pedestrian activity up to Houston Street at both ends of the street, one at Presa, for example, and complete with elevators. They wanted facade improvements for the buildings they had bought on Houston Street. They wanted improvements to the street itself. We had previously invested through the Downtown Tri-Party Project brick sidewalks and a chain street and lots of other goodies on Houston Street. It didn't quite work out the way they thought. No.
There's no Barnes & Noble.
There's no Barnes & Noble. Never was a Barnes & Noble. Isn't a Barnes & Noble. But what happened is that tax revenue was locked up, such as it was. There were some new office tenants. We got some new restaurants, Bohannon's, Texas to Brazil Steakhouse, some new restaurant tenants. The Majestic and Empire theaters made some difference there in terms of activity, but it never paid off the way it would. It was anticipated. It generated some monies that could be used, for example, when AT&T left the International Bank of Commerce complex, bank complex on Houston Street, to subsidize the parking of some new tenants. It was used ultimately to subsidize parking for USAA when they went into One Riverwalk Plaza. Right. But some years later, the city council had the grand idea of expanding the boundaries. So about 20 block Houston Street turned into 180 acres. That stretched from San Pedro Creek and the Interstate Juncture all the way down to Cesar Chavez on most all of the west side of downtown. And that money...
And now you get a new baseball stadium.
Well, and that money paid for part of the cost of the San Pedro Creek improvements and the Alameda Theater, the long list of things.
Yeah. So one interesting provision of the city and county's agreement with the missions owners is, okay, so you'll have 4 phases of private development overseen by Western Urban around the stadium.
For promise.
Potential.
Hoped for.
But hold on. It's not. There is this provision, which I did find pretty interesting, which is like, okay, so Western Urban has to be ready to start construction of $575 million worth of apartments and hotel rooms before the city will ever, or the TERS will ever sell bonds to build the stadium. And if the developer doesn't have the design work finished and the financing in place, the bonds don't get sold. Is that not a protection for taxpayers?
It's some protection, but the federal realty story and parallel stories, particularly here, suggest that things don't always work out as the developer promises and hopes. Partly there's this odd phenomenon that we sometimes forget about in these discussions called the market. Okay? So if Graham Weston and his colleagues anticipate building some hotel and apartment structures, and they've talked about an entertainment district, et cetera, that sounds great. But if the market won't support that, then things don't quite work. And I think we need to realize that the market's a very tough thing. And I've pointed to, for example, the deal that Weston Urban did in the Houston street tours for the new Frost Bank Tower and the sale of the old Frost Bank Tower to the city for what is now City Tower. The last time I checked, which would be for the end of the second quarter of this year, the vacancy rate for Class A office space, that's the best, newest, most desirable office space downtown, was in excess of 40%. That's remarkably high.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that Frost Bank Tower went in with the expectation that there were going to be new office tenants.
Right. That there was great demand for Class A, that we hadn't had new Class A space in decades, and now downtown, and now is the time.
And it turns out it's not quite the time. Right. And that's so the market realities are often not quite what one thinks. If there's a demand for new residential, new apartments, perhaps condos as well on that site, and the Weston Urban folks are right, that's great. But it may not be the case. And indeed, Graham Weston should know rack space is his piece of our.
He was a former chairman of rack space, one of the founders.
Has not quite worked the way that some folks had.
That's right.
Hoped it would. We'll see, but that's the peculiar reality of this.
Molly, do you get the sense that the city council is aware of the peculiar reality of the market, or what's the debate like about
I don't think so.
I mean, agreement?
I don't think council has really talked about the phases of development yet. I think they're mostly interested right now in what's going to happen to the soap factory apartments, which are going to be demolished to make room for this development. But I was curious to know, council is going to be voting on this on Thursday, and if you were a member of council, I would love to know what type of concessions you would want to get out of the ownership group before you approved a financing deal.
Well, there are a series of things. One is some serious bricks and mortar early. Not just we've got financing, we've got plans, but some serious construction. That offers the possibility. Don't forget, we're talking about incremental property tax revenues here. If you build a new apartment building and it turns out you can't lease those apartments, what a property owner is going to do is turn around, go to the appraisal district and say, I'm not making any money. You've got to lower your value assessment on this and lower my taxes, which in turn lowers the potential public revenue flow. So that's one dimension of it. The more concrete and fixed the development is, the better. Another piece of it is the scale of the public commitment. We know Graham Weston has been talking about this for years, and we know Graham Weston has an enormous investment in that sector. We know that Graham Weston donated $15 million to UTSA to get 2 new UTSA buildings built athwart San Pedro Creek, largely to help benefit his vision of a tech corridor in that area, a vision that doesn't seem to be prospering right now. So, Weston's prepared to use his own money in certain circumstances. The greater the private commitment to this, the more we see a developer committed to a place and likely to develop something. Then there's the issue of the soap factory, the former soap works on a site the city cleared with urban renewal in the 1960s. That's some of our most affordable, close-in housing. It was developed there in part to serve folks who worked at Santa Rosa Hospital and in the downtown area. As I understand it, the residents have not been particularly well informed about their circumstances. They should have been informed from the outset that this has been going on for, at least conceptually, for over a decade, raises a whole lot of questions about why.
Right. I would say the idea of a downtown stadium is about a decade old. The Weston, Randy Smith, also of Weston Urban, and a group of other investors bought the team in 2022.
Right.
So, but I mean, yeah, the idea has been around a long time. This site, though, I don't think has been part of the mix for about a decade. But that said, I mean, I think they probably not long after they started looking around at downtown sites, they probably settled on this fairly quickly. Okay.
Yeah, and to continue in the list, Molly, I would have liked to see this thing discussed and debated and considered in a more public, more thoughtful kind of way. Frankly, for a project of this magnitude that raises a whole lot of questions, I think council's been really remiss in how they've characterized it. This is not free money. They're public tax dollars.
Molly, how have they been talking about the project, just generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think you often hear it billed as something that comes at no cost to taxpayers and no cost to the general fund, which is that part of the city budget that funds essential city services.
Is it going to pass, by the way? So when they vote Thursday, is it?
Right now, I would say yes. I think you have a majority of council members. The two who have been most critical are the ones you would guess. District 5 Councilwoman Terry Castillo and District 2 Councilman Jalen McKee Rodriguez. Right. And Terry Castillo's critique really has been that it's disingenuous to say that this is going to come at no cost to taxpayers.
They're property tax revenues that would otherwise go directly into the general fund. The TERS structure locks them up for more than 20 years. I mean, that TERS was created, if I recall correctly, initially in 1999. So it's been going on, and this will extend it even further, and it's entirely likely it will be extended even beyond another 25 or 30 years from now.
Have you seen a TERS in San Antonio used for a project like this? Not just public improvements, but an entirely new building.
Nothing that comes to mind immediately. The Midtown TERS, which is the whole area of Broadway and the Pearl, et cetera, has generated money for a bunch of stuff. Houston Street's generated money for the Alameda Theater reconstruction. But the scale of this is the single project, particularly a sports facility, is pretty substantial. Yeah.
I'm going to guess you maybe think there should have been a public vote on this.
The thing that I would share with Molly in answer to your question next is, there should be a public vote on this.
Do you think the city put this deal together in such a way to avoid that? It's just kind of a side effect?
No, let's be clear about this. I mean, there's the finances and development stuff, and then there's the politics. And so granted, MLB's deadline for a better venue is there. But the timing of this, in my judgment, is far from coincidental. We have a lame duck mayor who can, if he chooses, point to this as a success of some sort, but who is not going to be on the ballot again and will suffer no direct electoral consequences from it. It's also the case that doing it with a TERS neatly avoids having a public vote. And we have a history on major downtown projects. I'm sure you recall the city's roughly $32 million for the downtown streetcar, or the financing for the public safety headquarters on Santa Rosa, which was done through a fiscal vehicle, certificates of obligation, that likewise doesn't require a public vote. That's how the city bought the Majestic and Empire theaters. So we have a history of doing big downtown deals that might be controversial and the public might not be happy with.
Does this make San Antonio any different from any other big city?
Not fundamentally, except that we have a history of doing these deals in ways that don't necessarily make much long-term sense. And you'll forgive me, then I have to enlighten your listeners to the in some ways, peculiarly parallel genesis of the AT&T Center. When the Spurs decided that they needed their own venue and they were tired of playing on one side of a great big blue curtain in the Alamo Dome and announced that they wanted their very own arena, we ended up with two competing visions for that arena. One from the county that used the county fairgrounds site by the Joe and Harry Freeman Coliseum that ended up being the choice, fundamentally the choice of the Spurs ownership. But a competing proposal from then Mayor Howard Peak for locating a new arena on the south parking lot of the Alamo Dome. So, oh my God, what are we doing now? We're essentially talking about putting it where it...
close. Near.
Where it could have been put with the same kind of promises of downtown revitalization and new investment.
Heywood, you've given us such a great transition to Project Marvel. So we'll leave the stadium behind.
Okay.
It's a done deal. I mean, council's going to agree to it. But Project Marvel, that's, who knows how that's going to play out. So this is a huge project. As I said in the intro, they're working on what the cost estimate actually is, but they're kind of spitballing it at $3 to $4 billion. And I think that probably includes everything, like the expansion of the convention center, upgrades at the Alamo Dome, and presumably Spurs Arena. I say presumably because the city and Spurs are saying nothing about the state of the talks. And it does seem like they're taking, and they're also, the city is also talking under non-disclosure agreements with real estate consultants and developers. So presumably there's going to be some private development probably around the arena. This looks like a massive project to me. Does this have any precedent in San Antonio history, or is this something new?
No. It would be comparable to Hemisphere in terms of its scale and potential impact if it proves to be market viable.
Right. Now the city is saying, to the extent that they say anything about it, it is that nothing's settled yet. This is, we're very far from having any kind of plan to present to the public. We will present something to the public. How we proceed, how we go from there is going to depend on, city council and public input. How do you see this playing out?
They're going to try and ram this thing through with a vote in the spring.
You think so?
I don't think there's any question about it.
Okay.
In the May municipal election.
And you mean, so you're,
Yes.
yeah, so you're expecting a bond issue for the arena? In the May ballot.
It would not appear that there is any way to finance this without going through a mechanism that involves a public vote.
Yeah.
But the answer to your question is no, I don't think it will be a bond election. What I think will happen is that the county will hold the vote. Using the revenue streams from the House Bill 92 venue taxes that we used to pay for the AT&T Center in the first place, and that we used subsequently to pay for improvements to the arena, to the existing arena, and a host of other public projects, including, much to my infinite amusement, the Museo Alameda at Market Square.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hold on.
So the venue tax offers the plus that it is essentially, arguably, taxes on visitors, a hotel occupancy tax and a tax on car rentals, countywide.
So its position not too different from saying we're using TERS money. This is not. It's not going to affect the general fund.
We're not going to affect your property taxes, which has some face validity, but fundamentally they're public revenues. And one should ask, given the potential uses of those public revenues, I might add parenthetically that among the uses of that second iteration of the county venue taxes were the financing for the museum Reach of the River improvements. So, we could use these tax dollars for something other than an arena if we chose.
Right.
But I seriously doubt we're going to be given that choice.
So, Molly, you've written a lot about non-disclosure agreements and the city's use of them. Tell us what you've learned in terms of NDAs and Project Marble.
Yeah, I mean, we know that essentially every time the city pitches this project to someone, whether it's a developer, whether it's UTSA, whether it's Hemisphere folks, they're required to first sign an NDA before even getting in the room with the city.
Is this new behavior on the city's part?
Yeah.
Have you seen this before?
No.
What do you
Have you?
I've not. No, really not.
No,
like this is
and
what do you think the reason is? Why are they doing this?
Well, why are they doing this? Because they want to do the public's business behind closed doors so that nobody knows what's going on until there's a deal all wrapped up with a ribbon, multiple ribbons, and they can say, we're going to do this and it's going to do great things. And somehow I've heard that pitch before, repeatedly.
Right.
In the 40 plus years I've lived here. So, I mean, this is to my mind, the ballpark saga enormously expanded. This is exactly the wrong way to do the public's business. Exactly the wrong way to do something without being a part of any long-term vision or plan for the immediate environs or for downtown. And that's frankly disturbing to me.
Right.
At the very least, here's Weston Urban talking about a new entertainment district as part of their proposed development along San Pedro Creek. They're talking about an entertainment district around a potential new Spurs arena, likely located at Hemisphere on the former Institute of Texan Culture site. So this would be brand new in San Antonio. We don't have any entertainment and restaurant districts at all, right? And the answer is no. We have the Riverwalk. We have the Pearl Brewery development. We have what was supposed to be our premier entertainment and restaurant district at Sunset Station when the Alamo was built. And you sit there, Greg, chuckling, as do I.
Anybody who's been there.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen this movie before.
Yeah.
The promises sound great. But, there was a plan for Hemisphere. We were talking about a public park area, recreating a new downtown community. It doesn't sound like something having a whole bunch of new private investment and an arena plopped in the middle of it. And yet at the same time, it's been clear to me for years that the only place you could expand the convention center or put another public facility would be at that ITC site. So in some ways, it's not surprising at all. It's totally predictable.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, arguably from a planning standpoint, exactly the wrong place to plop an arena.
Yeah.
How do you do that planning in an open way? Is it bringing in outside consultants, outside experts? I mean, what would the ideal process look like to determine what is the optimal place if we're going to do something like this?
Well, bringing in some outside expertise, pointing to some other examples, going through a much more extended process of public information and discussion, but wrapped up in NDAs. I think what we're going to get is a package that's going to be put on the table, and it's take it or leave it. And if the Alamo Dome and AT&T/Frost Bank Center are any indications, it's this with a whole lot of promises and feel-good stuff. We were sold, as Greg recalls, the then new Spurs Arena with all this stuff about scholarships for the kids and supporting the stock show and rodeo, et cetera, and some implicit promises about developing the East Side.
Right. Yeah, nothing. Yeah, nobody actually said jobs are coming. There's going to be a lot. You're going to have some really cool restaurants, office buildings, apartments. Nobody said that, but that seemed to be.
Yeah, that was the.
It was the vibe.
And then we did the Alamo Dome with Henry Cisneros, description of a multi-purpose convention and sports facility. With the emphasis invariably on the multi-purpose convention and very little on the sports facility. So we built a 65,000-seat stadium to then NFL specs with the argument it would get us an NFL expansion team, which has somehow yet to descend from the heavens.
Not happening.
No.
Okay. So last question. So you think that the city is going to, when they have a deal, it's all wrapped up for Project Marvel, they will then present it to the public. Public will respond. But at some point, the public, in your scenario, and I think this is really likely, will have to vote on it. And we seem to be in an environment where voters maybe aren't as enthusiastic about throwing money at team owners as they used to be. I might be overstating that a little bit. They're dealing still with high inflation. They've got a lot of economic uncertainty. And now, like throughout this fall, you'll see a lot of political uncertainty, and that could carry over into next year. Is it a slam dunk if this goes? If financing for a Spurs arena goes to voters next May?
I wouldn't see it as a slam dunk. The Spurs, some of the history of the AT&T Center development was that the Spurs tried a whole host of locations and mechanisms and approaches before they finally settled on the venue tax that would require a vote. They talked about doing it in a kind of TERS arrangement at the old quarry at I-35 and Wurzbach Parkway, using redirected property tax revenues. They talked about a whole variety of other approaches. Those didn't seem to fly. And a vote, they finally chose the vote because that was the one mechanism the state provided, and the state legislation requires a vote. It's just that simple. So no, I think the preference would be, as evidenced in the Missions ballpark deal, would be to do it without a vote. The scale that's involved, I don't think they can manage without some kind of public vote.
You don't think love of the Spurs is going to carry the day for them?
The Spurs have a lot of love, but the flip side of that was when it worked for AT&T, it worked in the immediate aftermath of an NBA
and they're first.
championship.
Yeah, they're very first.
Yes,
So,
and our
that's right.
this community's first. I mean, it was a very big deal.
Right.
Whether Wemby is
So what you're saying is they need a really different season this year. If they want to have any chance, it'll help. Maybe
it would make a difference. We'll see. Last season didn't make a great case for.
Yeah. I mean, we'd heard that the Spurs were actually trying to get something on the ballot in November. Not sure that would have gone really well, but seemed to be the thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you very much for your insights. We really appreciate it. Like I said, City Council is going to be voting on this September 12th. We'll see how it goes, though I suspect we already know. So thank you very much, and we will see you next week.